There is a moment in every great story when the silence becomes louder than anything that has ever been said out loud. This is one of those moments. On a quiet morning in London, behind walls that have stood for centuries and beneath flags that have never once admitted weakness, something shifted. Something that people inside the palace felt before they saw it, before they understood it, before they even had words for it. A name had been reconsidered. A title that had taken 50 years to earn was suddenly sitting in uncertain air. And the woman who had spent decades fighting her way into the hearts of the British people, who had stood through the storm, smiled through the grief, and earned what many once said she never deserved, found herself standing at the edge of something no one had ever warned her about. This is the story of Queen Camilla, King Charles, and the quiet earthquake that no one saw coming. To understand what is happening right now, you have to go back. You have to go further back than most people are willing to travel, because this story did not begin with a crown or a ceremony or a palace announcement. It began in the early 1970s at a polo match in Windsor, when a young Camilla Shand caught the eye of a prince who was still searching for something the world could not name for him. They were young, they were easy with each other in a way that royals rarely are with anyone. There was laughter between them. There was a kind of understanding that moved without effort, without performance, without the stiffness that royal life so often requires. And then, as it so often does in stories that carry this kind of weight, duty arrived and separated them. Charles left for a naval posting. Camilla moved on and married Andrew Parker Bowles in 1973. Years later, Charles married Lady Diana Spencer in 1981, in a wedding watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. A wedding that carried every hope a fairy tale could possibly hold. But the connection between Charles and Camilla never truly ended. That is the honest truth of it, however uncomfortable that truth may be to sit with. Through the years of his marriage to Diana, the contact continued in quiet ways. The letters continued. The phone calls continued. And when that marriage began to crack under the weight of mismatched expectations, royal duty, loneliness, and the crushing pressure of life under a global spotlight, those cracks led back to the same place. In 1992, when journalist Andrew Morton published his book about Princess Diana's private suffering, and in 1993, when a private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla was secretly recorded and then published in newspapers across the country, the affair became impossible to deny. Britain was stunned. The world was watching. And Camilla Parker Bowles became, overnight, one of the most talked-about women on the planet, though not in a way that was kind. The years that followed were some of the hardest of her life. Diana's death in a Paris tunnel in August 1997 broke the world's heart, and in the grief and the fury that poured out afterward, Camilla was not a figure of sympathy. She was the name spoken in anger. She was the woman behind the curtain, the reason the fairy tale had failed, the shadow over the story that people had loved so completely and so fiercely. She faced protests when she appeared in public. Photographers followed her everywhere, waiting for a moment of weakness. Newspapers printed headlines that were brutal in their directness. And the British public, still deep in its collective mourning for Diana, had very little patience for the woman they held partly responsible for everything that had gone wrong. She absorbed it. She stayed quiet through all of it. She did not fight back publicly. She did not arrange interviews to defend herself or weep into a camera to generate sympathy. She simply continued. She kept doing the work, supporting Charles, attending the events, meeting the people, giving to the charities, showing up with her quiet warmth and her unexpected humor and her genuine love for books and horses, and the particular pleasure of a good conversation with someone interesting. And slowly, painfully slowly, the needle began to move. Not everywhere, not all at once, but it moved. When Charles proposed to Camilla in 2003, and when they married in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall on the 9th of April 2005, it was not greeted with universal celebration. But neither was it met with the outright fury many had predicted. Time had softened certain things. The public had grown older with its grief. New royal concerns had arrived to take up space in the newspapers. And Camilla, who had never sought to replace Diana and had never behaved as though she expected to, had begun to earn something she had perhaps never fully expected to earn. A grudging respect, a cautious warmth, the slow, uncertain beginnings of public acceptance. But there was still the question of the title. There was always the question of the title. When the engagement was first announced, the official position of the palace was clear and carefully worded. When Charles became king, Camilla would be known as the princess consort. She would not be called queen. That was the understanding given to the British public, to the royal household, to the courtiers who managed the architecture of public feeling with such precision and care. It was a compromise born of sensitivity. It acknowledged the scars that Diana's memory had left on the national consciousness. It was a way of saying she belongs here. She is his wife. She is important, but she is not Diana's replacement. She is not stepping into that particular space. And for years, that was the settled plan. Camilla herself had stated publicly that she had no desire to be called queen. She said it plainly in interviews, without apparent resentment, as someone who had learned through long experience when to push and when to let things lie. She understood the politics of it completely. She understood what it would cost the monarchy if she pushed for something that the public was not yet ready to give her. She had spent long enough learning when to step forward and when to hold still. Then came February 2022. Queen Elizabeth II, in her Platinum Jubilee message marking 70 years on the throne, did something that surprised almost everyone who was paying attention. She wrote in clear and formal language that it was her sincere wish that when the time came, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort, not Princess Consort, not some softer, quieter designation. Queen Consort. The late Queen, who had spent years navigating the complexities of this situation with characteristic discretion, who had famously kept her views on personal family matters so close to her chest that most people assumed she simply had no views at all, had put it in writing. She had given her blessing from the very top of the institution that controlled everything. And the royal world, from Buckingham Palace down to the tabloids that covered its every breath, took profound notice. When Queen Elizabeth died in September 2022, Charles became king within minutes of her passing, as constitutional convention requires, and Camilla became Queen Consort. The palace confirmed it in the very first statement released after Elizabeth's death, not Princess Consort. Not some lesser designation carefully chosen to avoid offense. Queen Consort. The title was there in black and white, officially, publicly, without ambiguity. And in the months that followed, even the word consort began to quietly disappear from the way the palace referred to her in everyday communication. By the time of the coronation in May 2023, when Charles was crowned at Westminster Abbey in a ceremony that blended centuries of tradition with carefully considered modern touches, Camilla was crowned alongside him. The coronation invitations had said simply Queen Camilla. The palace website had been updated. She was, officially and completely, the queen. It had taken her 50 years to get there. 50 years of patience, endurance, public humiliation, private grief, quiet determination, and the particular kind of stubbornness that does not announce itself but simply refuses to leave. And now the walls that held the title safe for her were beginning to carry a different kind of conversation. Because behind the ceremony and the photographs and the smiling appearances at royal engagements, something else was moving, something quieter than any announcement. Something that people in the corridors of the palace were noticing before the outside world could put it into words. Prince William was growing into his power. He had always been the heir, always been next in line, always been the future of the monarchy in the most literal and constitutional sense. But there is a difference between being the future and beginning to shape the future, and somewhere in the years following his father's coronation, William had begun to step into the active work of defining what the crown would look like when it came to him. He had his own priorities. He had his own vision for what the monarchy should be, what it should stand for, how it should speak, and who should stand at its center. And not all of those priorities aligned seamlessly with the arrangement that had settled over the palace since May 2023. His relationship with Camilla was complicated in ways that the public only partly understood. He had grown up watching his parents' marriage break apart, had watched his mother suffer in ways that a child should never have to witness a parent suffer, and he knew, as all of Britain knew, the role that Camilla had played in that story. He was not a man driven by open bitterness. He had demonstrated over the years a capacity for pragmatism and for putting the institution ahead of personal feeling. But pragmatism has its limits, and the limits of William's pragmatism, where Camilla was concerned, were something that royal watchers had been quietly trying to map for years. And there was another dimension to this. There was Kate. Catherine, Princess of Wales, who had spent years building her own careful place within the royal family, navigating the expectations and the pressures with a discipline and a grace that had earned her enormous public admiration. Kate and Camilla had, by most accounts, a relationship that was professional and functional but not always warm. There had been reported friction at various points, small tensions that surfaced in the press and were quickly denied but never entirely disappeared. And with the question of succession always present in the background, the question of whose influence would define the next era of the monarchy was never far from anyone's mind. The palace felt something shifting, the courtiers felt something shifting. Somewhere inside the rooms of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, Queen Camilla, the woman who had survived every storm the British press and public had ever thrown at her, was beginning to feel it too. Because in the world of the monarchy, nothing is truly permanent. Every title exists within a framework of power and precedent and personal will. Every arrangement has a horizon. And beyond that horizon, whether anyone was ready for it or not, the future was already beginning to arrive. Something was coming, and the question that no one was yet saying plainly, at least not where microphones could catch it, was whether the title that had cost her so much to earn was now sitting on ground less solid than it had appeared. The storm was quiet, but storms like this always begin that way. The British monarchy has always been a place where the most important things happen in rooms that most people will never see. The decisions that reshape the crown, the conversations that alter the course of royal history, the moments that determine who sits where and who carries what title, these things rarely happen in public. They happen in private studies and long corridors, and over cups of tea taken in drawing rooms where the curtains are thick enough to swallow sound. And so it was that the tension beginning to gather around Queen Camilla's position within the family did not announce itself with any dramatic confrontation or palace press release. It gathered the way weather gathers, first in small signs that can be read by those who know how to look, and then, before long, in something that everyone could feel. The seeds of this particular tension had been growing for a long time. When King Charles ascended the throne in September 2022, he brought with him a lifetime of preparation and a deep, genuine love for the institution he was inheriting. He had waited longer than any heir in British history to take the crown, and he had used those decades of waiting to develop strong views about what the monarchy should be and how it should function. He believed in a streamlined monarchy, one focused on service and relevance. He believed in Camilla completely and without reservation. And he had used the authority of his position to ensure that the woman he loved was accorded the recognition he had always believed she deserved. But Charles was also a man dealing with serious health challenges. His cancer diagnosis, confirmed publicly in early 2024, had sent a quiet tremor through the institution. The palace had managed the news carefully, emphasizing the king's continued commitment to his duties and the positive responses to his treatment. Charles himself had been determined not to retreat. He kept his schedule as full as he could manage. He appeared in public with the composure that a lifetime of royal training produces. But the reality of a king dealing with illness, combined with an heir who was increasingly confident and capable and present, created a shift in the balance of institutional gravity that was impossible for anyone inside the palace to ignore entirely. William was no longer simply waiting in the wings. He was actively engaged, increasingly vocal about his priorities, increasingly willing to use the platform and the influence that came with being the Prince of Wales. He had made the environment one of his major public causes, and he pursued it with an energy and a seriousness that had changed the way a significant portion of the public thought about him. He had grown from the golden prince of his parents' wedding into something more complicated and more interesting. A man with genuine convictions, a strong and capable wife in Catherine, and a clear sense of the kind of monarchy he intended to build. And with that sense of the future came, inevitably, the question of Camilla. Because under the constitutional reality of British royal succession, Camilla's position was directly dependent on the life of the man she had married. She was queen because Charles was king. When Charles's reign ended, whether through death or any other circumstance, that particular version of her title would end with it. She would not simply remain queen in perpetuity. She would transition to a different designation entirely. The official term for it, established by centuries of royal precedent, is Queen Dowager. It is a title of respect, a recognition of her former status, but it carries no active constitutional role. It places her outside the working center of the monarchy. It acknowledges the past without giving her a seat in the future. This was not a secret. Royal commentators and constitutional scholars had discussed it openly for years. When William ascended, Catherine would become queen consort. The palace's attention, the public's attention, the institutional weight of the monarchy would move to the new generation. Camilla would step back to Ray Mill, her beloved home in Wiltshire where she had always kept her own private life separate from the demands of the palace, to her children and grandchildren, to the organizations and charities she had worked for. She would retain her dignity and her history, but the title and the position that she had fought so long to reach would belong to someone else. What began to surface in the press during 2025 and into 2026, however, was something slightly different from this constitutional eventuality. It was not simply the mechanics of succession that people were discussing. It was the texture of the relationship between Camilla and the next generation of the royal family, and in particular between Camilla and Catherine, that was generating a particular kind of attention. Reports emerged in early 2026 that tensions between the two women had escalated to a point that palace aides described, with characteristic royal understatement, as difficult to contain. The language used in one published account was sharper than the usual palace vocabulary. Open warfare was the phrase that appeared in a respected magazine, and whatever the precise accuracy of that language, it signaled something genuine about the atmosphere inside the family. The reported flashpoint was specific, rooted in a moment during the state visit of an American president and his wife to Britain. At a formal reception, Camilla was said to have dismissed Catherine from a conversation in a way that had struck observers as pointed and deliberate. It was a small moment in the architecture of a large and formal event. But small moments in royal life carry disproportionate weight because they are read as signals of something larger, as evidence of the underlying currents that the public face of the monarchy works so hard to conceal. The reported incident circulated. It was discussed. It was denied by palace sources, as these things always are, but the denial did not entirely extinguish the conversation. What it added to was a picture that had been building for some time. Camilla and William's relationship, while never openly hostile, had always carried a particular complexity. He had managed his feelings about her with the discipline of someone who understood that the institution required him to. He had appeared alongside her at public events, had spoken respectfully of her role, had behaved in all the ways that a future king is expected to behave. But the warmth that William could display so naturally with others, the easy familiarity that characterized his public interactions at their best, was never quite the same when Camilla was in the frame. People who watched closely noticed it. Royal journalists who had covered the family for decades noticed it. It was the absence of something, more than the presence of anything, that told the story. And then there was the matter of Prince Harry. The Sussexes' situation had become one of the defining dramas of Charles's reign, the estrangement of his younger son creating a wound that refused to heal cleanly no matter how many overtures were made or meetings arranged. Charles had wanted reconciliation, deeply and consistently, in the way that a father wants it regardless of what the institution requires. By 2025, cautious steps had been taken. Private meetings had occurred. There were signs that the relationship between Charles and Harry was beginning, with tremendous care and considerable uncertainty, to move toward something better. Trusted observers who spoke to both sides said the king was hopeful. Harry had said publicly that he was ready to rebuild. Camilla's position on this was more complicated. She had been targeted specifically and painfully in Harry's 2023 memoir, which had described the dynamics of the family in terms that left marks. She was not, by any account, enthusiastic about the prospect of the Sussexes re-entering the royal orbit. She had been open about this in private conversations, and those conversations had a way of reaching the press eventually. She was said to believe that Charles was taking a risk that could cost him considerably. That the trust required for genuine reconciliation did not yet exist, and perhaps could not yet exist. That the history was simply too complicated, and the public nature of the breakdown too thorough to be easily undone by goodwill and a few private meetings. This put her, quietly but meaningfully, in a different position from her husband. Charles wanted the door to be open. Camilla wanted it held more carefully, more skeptically, more at arm's length. And the gap between those positions, even in a marriage as steady and as genuinely loving as theirs appeared to be, created its own small pressure. Royal insiders who spoke to journalists about this dynamic were careful to note that it was not a crisis. It was not the kind of marital tension that generates headlines about separation or breakdown. Charles and Camilla were, by all appearances, still a team. But teams can disagree on strategy. And disagreements on strategy, in a family where strategy is indistinguishable from survival, have a way of mattering more than they would anywhere else. All of this was unfolding against a backdrop that added its own particular pressure. The question of what would happen to Camilla's title was not just a constitutional abstraction. It was a personal reality that she was navigating in real time, in a family that was already dealing with more than its share of complexity. She was 78 years old. She had given more than 20 years to the public service of the crown. She had transformed her reputation through the specific discipline of keeping her head down and doing the work. And now the work itself was changing shape around her, and the question of what came next was being shaped by people whose relationship with her was complicated enough to give anyone pause. There were voices, and not only hostile ones, that had begun to raise a different kind of conversation. Not about the constitutional reality of succession, but about something more immediate. Something that touched on the question of whether the arrangement that had settled over the palace since the coronation was as stable as it appeared. Whether the title that Camilla now held was as secure in the present tense as the ceremony of 2023 had suggested. Whether the forces gathering around her were simply the normal mechanics of succession beginning to make themselves felt, or whether something more active, more deliberate, more consequential was beginning to take shape. Nobody was saying it plainly, not in any official capacity, not from any named source, but in the specific way that royal stories move, through inference and implication, and the careful reading of what is not said rather than what is. The question was present. It was in the air of the palace. It was in the conversations between royal correspondents who had been covering this family long enough to know what silence looks like when it means something. It was in the shape of what was coming next, which was not yet clear but which felt, to everyone paying close attention, like it was going to matter enormously. The title was there, but the ground beneath it was moving, and the woman who had spent 50 years earning it was about to find out what it meant to hold something precious in a landscape that would not hold still. In the final chapter of any great story about power, there comes the moment when the question that everyone has been moving around finally steps into the center of the room. This is that moment in the story of Queen Camilla and the title she has carried, the moment when all the history and the tension and the quiet accumulation of pressure resolves itself into something that demands to be understood. Not because anyone has made a simple, single decision in some clean and dramatic way that Hollywood would recognize, but because reality, in the life of the monarchy as in every other life, has a way of arriving on its own schedule and without much concern for what anyone is or is not ready to accept. The British monarchy has survived for 1,000 years because it understands one thing better than almost any other institution on earth, that the appearance of continuity and the reality of change are not opposites. They are tools. The crown has always changed, always adapted, always quietly revised what it was and how it functioned, while presenting to the outside world a face of serene permanence. The genius of the institution is precisely this capacity to transform without ever appearing to transform, to shift the balance of power in ways that are real and significant while the public face remains composed and ceremonial and reassuring. And it is within this genius, within this particular kind of institutional intelligence, that the question of Camilla's title has been playing out. The constitutional reality is not in dispute. It never has been. Camilla is queen while Charles is king. When Charles's reign ends, as every reign must end, she will become queen dowager. She will have no constitutional role. She will step back from the active center of the monarchy, retaining her dignity, her history, her charitable work if she chooses to continue it, but no longer occupying the position that she has held since the coronation of May 2023. This is not a punishment or a removal or a decision made against her. It is the simple mathematics of royal succession, as settled and as uncontroversial as the fact that water runs downhill. When the crown passes, the title passes with it. Catherine will become queen consort. A new chapter will begin. But the question that has been generating so much attention and so much careful, guarded conversation among royal watchers and palace insiders is not about the distant constitutional future. It is about the texture of the present. It is about what is happening right now, inside the walls of a monarchy that is managing several enormous pressures at once. A king dealing with illness while continuing to serve, an heir growing into the full weight of his future role, a family fractured by the departure of the Sussexes and the very public fallout of the last several years, and a woman at the center of all of it who has spent her entire adult life learning to navigate storms, and who now finds herself in the middle of one that is quieter and more complex than any she has faced before. The tension between Camilla and William, whatever its precise temperature and nature, reflects something real about the transition the monarchy is undergoing. William is not simply the next king in waiting. He is already, in certain practical ways, the next king in action. His visibility has increased. His initiatives have grown. His voice within the institution has become more assertive as Charles's health has required him to carry more of the public weight of the crown. And with that increasing presence comes, inevitably, an increasing clarity about what kind of monarchy he intends to lead. Who will be central? Who will be peripheral? What the working royal family will look like? Who will be expected to step back, and when and how far? Camilla has read these signals with the intelligence that has always been one of her underappreciated qualities. She is not a naive woman. She is not someone who mistakes the appearance of comfort for the reality of security. She has been around long enough, has navigated enough difficult terrain to understand the difference between the way things look and the way things are. And what she has been understanding, in those private hours at Ray Mill and in the quiet moments between public engagements, is that the landscape she built her position within is shifting in ways that go beyond anything she can simply endure and outlast. This is not a storm of public opinion that patience and grace can weather. This is structural. This is about the future itself reorganizing around priorities that are not, at their center, hers. Charles, for his part, has remained her most steadfast defender. His love for her has never wavered. His belief in the rightness of her title and her place has not diminished. And in the particular dynamics of a monarchy where the sovereign's will still matters enormously in the shaping of day-to-day reality, his protection has been real and active. He has not allowed her to be sidelined in the ceremonial life of the crown. He has continued to ensure that she appears alongside him at the major events that define what the monarchy looks like to the watching world. He has, in the ways available to him, made his feelings known. But there are limits to what even a king can hold in place against the inevitable motion of time and succession. There are limits to what personal will can do against institutional gravity. And the institutional gravity of the British monarchy has always, in the end, moved in the direction of the next generation. The future is patient. The future does not need to fight. It simply waits, and in the waiting, everything else rearranges itself accordingly. What royal commentators, historians, and constitutional scholars have been pointing out with increasing frequency is that the question of Camilla's title, stripped of its dramatic framing, is actually a question about something much larger. It is a question about how the monarchy manages the transition from one era to another. It is a question about what respect looks like when the institution is carrying the weight of its own history and the complexity of its own human relationships simultaneously. It is a question about whether a woman who gave decades of her life to the crown, who transformed her public reputation through genuine service and genuine character, will be treated in the eventual transition with the dignity that transformation deserves. There are those who argue that Queen Dowager is not a lesser title, but simply a different one, that it reflects her changed circumstances accurately and respectfully, that it is what constitutional precedent dictates, and that constitutional precedent exists for good reasons. They are not wrong about the precedent. Queen Adelaide, the wife of King William IV, held the title Queen Dowager from 1837 onward. She was treated with great respect during Queen Victoria's reign. She continued to be a presence, though a quieter one in the life of the institution. The title was not, in that historical usage, a diminishment. It was an acknowledgement. But others, and this is where the conversation becomes more pointed, argue that what matters is not just the formal designation, but the atmosphere in which it is received. That the difference between being a Queen Dowager who is treated with warmth and integrated into the continuing life of the royal family, and being one who is quietly pushed to the margins of public visibility, is not written in any constitutional document. It is written in the will and the culture of the institution at the moment the transition occurs, and the will and the culture of that institution will be shaped, when the time comes, by William, by his instincts, by his priorities, by the long and complicated history that he carries on the subject of this particular woman. Camilla knows this, and the fact that she knows it, the fact that she is navigating this reality with the same quiet intelligence she has applied to every difficult season of her life, is perhaps the most interesting thing about where the story currently stands. She is not, by any available evidence, responding to the shifting ground with panic or with demands or with public complaints. She is doing what she has always done. She is continuing. She is showing up. She is doing the work with the warmth and the groundedness and the occasional unexpected humor that have slowly, over the years, won over people who once would have crossed the street to avoid acknowledging her existence. In the spring of 2026, she was photographed at a formal reception alongside Catherine, the two women smiling with the composed ease of people who have learned the royal art of public grace regardless of private feeling. She continued her charitable work. She continued her public engagements. She remained, in every visible way, the Queen. And Charles remained the King, continuing his duties with the determination of a man who understands that showing up is itself a form of leadership, a form of courage, a form of saying to the institution and to the public that the work continues and that the crown endures. But the conversation about what comes next has not stopped. It has simply shifted register, moving from the realm of dramatic speculation into the quieter space of genuine constitutional and historical discussion. What does the monarchy owe the woman who spent half a century earning her place within it? What does respect for that journey look like in practice? How does an institution built on tradition manage the very human complexity of two women, one the established queen and one the queen-in-waiting, occupying the same family and the same public space, their futures inevitably in tension in ways that no protocol can entirely smooth over? These questions do not have easy answers. They never have in this family, in this institution, in this story that has been unfolding for decades, and has never been as simple as the headlines have made it seem. What is clear is that the title Camilla carries today was fought for and earned through a journey that was longer and harder than most people would have been willing to make. What is equally clear is that the title has an expiration date built into it by the logic of succession, and that expiration date is becoming a more present reality with every passing month. The palace walls have heard everything. They have heard the early conversations between a prince and the woman he could not stop loving. They have heard the grief of a nation that could not easily forgive her. They have heard the slow and genuine transformation of public opinion. They have heard the late Queen's sincere wish, delivered in formal writing, that this woman be recognized. They have heard the sound of a crown being placed on her head in Westminster Abbey while the world watched. And now they are hearing something else, something that does not yet have a clear name, but that carries the particular weight of a future that is arriving whether anyone is ready for it or not. Queen Camilla will, in all probability, hold her title for as long as Charles reigns. She will continue the work she has always done with the commitment that has always characterized it. She will stand beside her husband with the loyalty that has been the truest constant of her royal life. But somewhere beyond that continuity, in a future that is already casting its shadow into the present, the shape of things is changing. The woman who spent 50 years fighting to be recognized is now watching the ground shift around that recognition. And what she does with that knowledge, how she navigates it, what she protects and what she releases, is perhaps the final and most consequential chapter of the most complicated royal story of the modern era. The walls of the palace know everything. They always have. And right now, in the particular silence that falls when something enormous is approaching, those walls are listening harder than ever.